Every medieval town was bound to have a tavern, a bathhouse, and a brothel. Despite the complexity and ambiguity of the topic of sex work, it has existed for most of human history, and for a better understanding of this topic, it is worth understanding how brothels appeared and why they were so popular. Everyone knows which profession is called the oldest. That's what they say about sex work, but it's wrong. It is obvious that much earlier man had mastered hunting, gathering, and farming. The first real information about sex work dates back to the 2400s before the Common Era. In the Sumerian city of Uruk, there were brothels attached to temples where local priestesses worked. The temples were dedicated to Ishtar, the goddess of fertility and love, and her cult included many sexual practices. And Ishtar herself was considered the patroness of prostitutes. The Sumerians had a practice of sacred prostitution. Sex work was considered sacred and important for the existence of society. Thus, kings asserted their legitimacy through sexual relations with the priestesses of Ishtar, which symbolized the connection with the most important gods. Sex work was widespread in ancient Palestine as well. This image appears frequently even in the Bible. In ancient Israelite society, sex workers were protected by law. In the New Testament, Christ even says, "Truly, I say to you that tax collectors and prostitutes go ahead of you into the kingdom of God." Sex work was also common in ancient Greece, though along with it there was the practice of having sex with slave girls. Slaves were not considered human beings under the law, so there were no restrictions on relations with them. Often men could acquire slaves for sexual purposes only. Much less is known about women who had relations with male slaves, although such cases also occurred. In ancient Greece, the life of a woman, even a noble woman, was generally unenviable. She could not leave the house without her husband and had little or no autonomy. The wife was seen in the home solely as the keeper of the hearth and mother of heirs. Many ancient Greeks needed a wife only for procreation and slaves to fulfill sexual needs. In ancient Greece, there was also traditional sex work that was practiced by both women and men. We know much more about the special profession of hetera. Heteras were free women, had property rights unlike ordinary wives, and could even become rich. Their main task was to entertain men during feasts. Ancient Greek women could in no way be there, so that's why they began to call heteras. They had to be intelligent, educated, able to talk about everything in the world, make jokes, play musical instruments, and recite poetry. Sexual relations were also part of the relationship with heterae, though by no means always. Also in ancient Greece, as well as in the ancient East, priestesses provided sexual services in temples. The first regular brothels also appeared in Athens. They employed women of all ages and young men, and the prices for their services were regulated by the state. Things were somewhat different in ancient Rome. There were also sex work, heteras, and in the cities there are still several brothels. At the same time, women in Rome had a much higher status than in Greece, and they were not forbidden to attend feasts. Everyone knows about Roman feasts and the debauchery that reigned at them. We've got a video about it. The Empress Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, was known for her incredible promiscuity. She was engaged in sex work and once, according to some reports, even arranged a competition with a famous prostitute in Rome and won. Although most likely these are just tales of ill-wishers and legends, the ancient Rome is generally known as a debauched society. But it was a huge empire that created the foundation for modern Western law. During the Middle Ages in Europe, sex work had a very controversial status. Brothels were becoming more and more numerous, appearing in almost every city. But the Catholic Church looked at any extramarital affairs as a grave sin. After all, sexual relations could exist only between husband and wife and only for procreation. That's why sex work was condemned. On the other hand, the Church considered it a necessary evil, without which everything would drown in lust, debauchery, and violence. Brothel workers were in a difficult position, although laws protecting them appeared in many cities. In Muslim countries, extramarital affairs were strictly forbidden, and the enforcement of these rules was closely monitored, so there were no brothels, although this did not preclude violence against women and sexual relations with slaves. In medieval India, many local states regulated sex work. It was also common in temples, but full-fledged brothels would appear much later. In India, there was also a class of women similar to the hetairas and geishas. Here they were called tawaif. Their social status was very high. The tawaifs contributed immensely to the development of Indian music, dance, and even cinema. Gradually, brothels became more common in Europe and their activities were regulated by law. Thus, at the beginning of the 19th century in Paris, there were almost 200 official brothels, and the brothel sphinx was considered the most luxurious and enjoyed great success among the Parisian elite. Sex work was legalized in the Russian Empire as well. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were more than 2,000 brothels across the country. Unfortunately, for most of human history, sex work has been associated with violence against women. This was especially evident during major wars. Rape has almost always accompanied military conflicts and was not considered something special. In First World War, the French army began using brothels in military camps to deal with possible rampant violence. But it took its most brutal form during World War II. The Japanese army forced women in the occupied territories into sexual slavery and set up so-called comfort houses for its soldiers. Tens of thousands of women in Korea, China, and the Philippines went through this horrific, inhumane practice. After World War II, sex work became illegal in many countries. Now views on it are gradually being reconsidered. In many European countries, it has become legal again. But the debate about the impact of legalizing sex work on women, the slave trade, and coercion is still ongoing. Nevertheless, we need to strive for a society in which women are not forced to provide sexual services to support themselves or their families. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and share with friends.